start off, I'll talk a little bit about my background. I've been a self-confessed lyrebird addict for a long time now, since I was about 11 years old. I started in primary school meeting the lyrebird lady, Jan Incole, from the Sherbrooke Lyrebird Survey Group in Sherbrooke Forest, and trying to track these incredible birds. I wasn't ever a fan of school in primary school. I tended to think it was all a bit of a waste of time. So when it came to thinking about high school, I tried to convince my parents, successfully in the end, to let me be homeschooled from years 7 to 11, which I was. And this allowed me to meet up with Jan in Sherbrooke about 5 or 6 days a week. I still had to go to school for 1 day a week and get a whole lot of homework, but I thought that was a pretty good compromise. And this sort of led me into this world of lyrebirds, which was fantastic. I really became very interested in photography, and you'll probably see throughout this talk that there's quite a number of photographs that I've taken over the years. And this actually led me in to try and do a photography course at university. But I had a number of natural history photographers I knew that were sort of saying to me, Alex, you really should go and do your science degree and do your photography on the side. And in the end, I heeded that advice and went to Deakin University and did an undergraduate degree in environmental science. This led on to my honours year, where I studied the lyrebirds and habitat use, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then on to a PhD, which I'm in the final stages of, about to submit, and I'll talk a little bit about this as well. So to give you a little bit of a rundown of what I've done with this talk, I've broken it into 5 sections. The first part, I'll introduce you to the lyrebird and talk about it in the context of a recovering landscape. And when I say a recovering landscape, I'm not talking about big fires that we've had, but I'm actually talking about recovering from colonisation and a massive clearing event that's gone on over the past 200 years. In the second part, I'm going to go on to talk about lyrebirds as ecosystem engineers. And this is getting back to my PhD research and why this species is actually really important. I'll make the point now that I'll gloss over some of the graphs and statistics that I've done here, because a lot of this research is actually not yet being peer reviewed and published. So I might just, instead of showing you a whole bunch of graphs and big model output tables, which I'm sure you'd be really excited to see, I've actually just made a few little animations to get the point across as to what lyrebirds are doing in this system. And then in part 3, we're going to take a little bit of a change of gear and talk about the summer of 2019 and 20, when the bushfires were raging across the East Coast. And then within this context, I'm going to go through the rest of the talk and relate lyrebird ecology to fire and how the implications of fire, what they mean for this species. And then part 5, the final section, is a little bit of a where to from here. So, to start off with, there are 2 species of lyrebirds. There's the Albert's lyrebird up in northern New South Wales and southern Queensland, and they only occur in this tiny little section of subtropical rainforest here. They're a smaller species of lyrebird, and they've got these less ornate lyrate feathers in their tail, and they live in rainforests. So they're in really dense habitat, and they call similar to the superb lyrebirds. They're quite a pretty bird, I think, but they don't have quite the same extravagant tail that our superbs have. So the superb lyrebird is the one that I'm talking about, and that's this bird here. So the range is a little bit more extensive from Fish Creek in South Gippsland all the way up to Girrawheen National Park, which is just over the border with New South Wales into Queensland. And there's a little introduced population that's actually become not so small in Tasmania. And this is an interesting story, but they were worried that we were going to lose the lyrebirds on the mainland because of all this hunting that was going on for these beautiful big tail feathers. So these tail feathers were used in ladies' hats back in the 30s. So they transported about 22 birds or thereabouts back in the 30s, and these birds have actually taken off. Now they're really worried about them because they're ripping up all these moss beds. So you can ask more questions about that later if you're interested. But the superb lyrebird shot to fame in Attenborough's Life of Birds series. So here's Attenborough down here with the lyrebird in front of him. This was actually a wild bird. There's an interesting story there too, because the bird that you see in the Attenborough reproducing all the human origin sounds was actually a bird in Hillsville Sanctuary that was bred in captivity. So another interesting little side story. But they're quite a long-lived bird. They can live up to 30 years in captivity. We don't really know how long they live in the wild, because when we put bands on them to mark individuals, the bands fall off usually after about 10 years. So the birds outlive the bands. They have very slow life history traits. So they mature late and they breed slowly. They have very small clutch size or single egg clutch. And importantly, they forage for invertebrates in litter and soil. But this is the sort of behaviour they're famous for. So that's his centrepiece of the kookaburra that everybody recognises. But lyrebirds have long fascinated people. And a lot of it is owing to their incredible song. And I might just get Jen to put up the poll if she can, to ask people how many of us think we've actually heard lyrebirds reproduce human sounds. So I'm not sure if we'll be able to see that poll. Oh, there we go, it's up there. So I'd be interested to know how many people say they think they've heard human sounds. But there is a really fascinating story that's gone around in Armidale in northern New South Wales of a lyrebird chick that was taken from a nest like this one here, which hopefully my laser will work. Yep. So this little month-old nestling is about the age of this chick that was meant to be taken out of a nest up in Armidale by a farmer's son. And he found the nest, took the chick out, put it in his chook pen and grew it up as a pet. And the farmer's son played the flute, and this lyrebird learned how to sing the flute, because lyrebirds learn which songs to sing from the older males. And it's picked up this flute song and used it as a territorial song. It became a male, grew a big tail, and then either escaped or was released into the wild and taught all the other lyrebirds in the surrounding landscape this flute song. And you can still hear the flute song today. So there you go, 42% of our results say that we've heard human origin sounds. Some that are not sure, 27%, and 32% that haven't. Now that's interesting because it's actually, in my experience, really rare to hear human origin sounds. But I'll play this flute song for you and see what you think. It's very flute-like. So this was the territorial whistle song. So it's one of those calls that's really hard to say whether it is or isn't of human origin. And a paper was done by a group up in northern New South Wales or in the Blue Mountains, Vicky Powies and Carol Proberts, that found that we won't ever really be able to be sure. They thought possibly not. It might actually be the lyrebird's own song, but it certainly does make for a good story and it sounds incredible. But I've had experiences in Sherbrooke where lyrebirds have, I think, mimicked human origin sounds, and in particular, human voice. And this is a really rare thing to hear, but it often happens in the off season, so when they're not breeding, so over summer. And the males make these really strange improvising sort of calls where they're not actually doing specific calls that we could recognise. And they do it in courtship to females. And this is a call I recorded, and we'll see what you think, because I think it's pretty indisputable. but there's a whistle and then there's some human speech. So see if you can pick up the whistle and then the human speech in this recording. What is this bird saying? I might just play it again if I can. Play this one again for you, because just in case someone wants it again. So that's the most convincing human origin sound I've heard in a wild lyrebird. But as I say, it's a very rare thing to actually hear. Most of the calls that we hear that we think are human origin sound are actually the lyrebird's own calls, and they're generally associated with the dance song. They sound like lasers is what often gets described. But obviously a lyrebird's not going to hear computer lasers in the forest. And this is part of its own dance song, and I'll show you a clip later of that. But now I want to take you to the Dandenong Ranges, the home of these magnificent mountain ash trees, like in this picture, the tallest flowering plant in the world. But I want to take you back in time to about 1900. And this is when European colonists were first coming up into this area and starting to check the place out and see what was up here. And you can see by this photo, they were obviously very taken with tree fern fronds, but also the attire looks quite different to what we see today. And things looked quite different. So this is a big tree in Sassafras Gully. So this is where the Friends of Sassafras Creek now work. And you can see here, there's a little person here and another one up here. So that just gives that tree a bit of context. It's a huge mountain ash that's come down on a slope in a winter rain. And then for those that are botanically minded, you might recognise this as a slender tree fern. So, and then this one up here, these very skinny tree ferns. And these are rare species that are still found in Sassafras Gully today. But these trees were big. I mentioned they were the largest flowering plant in the world, but look at this compared to this horse. So this is a huge old mountain ash, and this horse standing in front of it, I mean, that hollow is as big as a small living room. Really large tree. And this one looks as if it's been fire killed. So they're very sensitive to fire, mountain ash, and even a relatively mild fire could kill big trees. So that's one issue for mountain ash with fire. But here, this is when people were first coming in to clear the mountain ash, and you can see up the top of this tree, there's a guy standing there, and he's got no safety harness on that I can see. And this is apparently one of the early communication lines into the Dandenongs. So these photos were all taken by AG and AJ Campbell. It was a father and a son, and they were both natural history photographers, so quite remarkable. And then as time went on, the landscape really got cleared. These tree ferns out here in the paddock, these didn't germinate in this paddock. They had a forest that was cleared around them. And you can see in this background image, the mountain ash forest, the big trees here, and then there are these gaps in between. There's a big gap here and a big gap there. And if you think about when you drive now from a place like Belgrave up through Sherbrooke Forest to Callista, the canopy of the eucalypts is virtually touching over the road. So it's a very different forest structure to what it would be if it were a really old, untouched natural forest. And then this is the view from Mount Dandenong. Blackened trees, leafless trees, and cleared ridgelines. So a really different environment to what we see today. And just unrecognisable, really. So this map here is a map from the Department of Environment, Land and Water, DELP, and they have mapped different vegetation types. So each colour you see here is a different vegetation community. So Sherbrooke Forest is about here, Ferntree Gully is labelled there, Lilydale, out to Heidelberg. And this is what DELP thinks was present before European clearing. This is what we're left with. So you can see all these white areas. This is all cleared land. And if you're an animal or a plant trying to live in somewhere like Sherbrooke Forest, if you want to move through this landscape, it's a really convoluted path, and it's a very different place to what it would otherwise be. So it's quite a changed environment. So getting back to the lyrebird. Well, the lyrebird has been seen as an important species. It's important because it plays a really key role in nutrient cycling. David Ashton and Owen Bassett did some work back in the 90s that looked at the soil that lyrebirds were moving, and they put this magnetic buckshot along the slopes, and they measured that lyrebirds moved all of this material about 70 centimetres downhill in a single year. More recently, some colleagues of mine at La Trobe, Dan Nugent and Steve Leonard, did some work on fuel loads and the lyrebird's contribution to those. And what they actually found was that lyrebirds, through burying the leaf litter, effectively removed about 1.66 tonnes per hectare of fine fuels that contribute to the spread and severity of wildfire. So they're actually changing fire regimes. And it's for these reasons that lyrebirds have been considered to be ecosystem engineers. But there's been a lack of research into the biotic response. So how does the wildlife, how do the plants respond to all of this disturbance? And that's what my PhD has really concentrated on. So what are ecosystem engineers? Well, ecosystem engineers are animals or plants, organisms that change the physical environment in ways that affect other species. And these effects can actually be really big. So this image here is a satellite image of the Negev Desert, the border, the Palestinian border with Egypt and Israel. And you can see here, there's a really big difference between what's happening in Egypt and what's happening in Palestine or Israel. And this is owing to some ecosystem engineers. So firstly, we've got cryptogamic crust, what's called cryptogamic crust. And this is all the lichens and mosses that grow on the desert surface. And when it rains, these lichens and mosses sheet off water, and that water accumulates at a second ecosystem engineer, and that is these shrubs. So desert shrubs that grow accumulate water and nutrient, and then in that water and nutrient, they can make, they actually achieve a greater productivity. And that's what you're seeing on this side here. So this is the natural system. But on this side, there's a third ecosystem engineer that's been introduced to the system by human beings, and that is hard-hooved cattle. And of course, when you have cattle at high stocking densities, they break up that cryptogamic crust and let the water infiltrate where it falls. So you lose productivity. And that's what we're seeing here. So these can be really big impacts. In Australia, of course, we've got lots of fantastic wildlife. And a lot of these wildlife are diggers. So the one on the left here is a little southern brown bandicoot digging in a lyrebird mound, actually, as is on the right in a lyrebird mound. But this one's a long-footed potteroo up on Mount Buffalo. And both of these species are endangered. So these are our mammalian diggers, but there's a whole range of different species that actually engineer through digging. The more obvious ones might be echidnas, but there's also reptiles like sangoaners that dig in the soil for food and also make burrows for shelter, and even earthworms. So this was a giant earthworm I found up at Errinundra with my partner Megan, and if anyone knows what it is, I'd be quite interested because it was huge, not so much long, but so fat next to that $2 coin. So to study the lyrebirds as an ecosystem engineer, I went to look at birds in the Central Highlands of Victoria. So here we are here in Sherbrooke. So this is where I am now. This is Yarra Ranges State Forest around Britannia Creek. So there's Britannia Creek Caves out there. And then Yarra Ranges National Park here, which is a beautiful national park. And the little red dots you see are my study sites. And I wanted to study lyrebirds and how they interact with the ecosystem in the three main vegetation types. So we've got the first one up here. This is damp forest, and this is dominated by the messmate stringy barks and the mountain grey gums. This one here, the second one, is the mountain ash forest, the wet forest. So that's what's sort of most common in Sherbrooke. And then down the bottom here, we've got cool temperate rainforest. And in the Dandenong Ranges, this is dominated by the sassafras tree, which of course is what the township's named after. And this is a really beautiful type of forest, but it's quite rare in the landscape, usually only hanging on in the gullies, partly because so much of the landscape was cleared and it takes a really long time to grow back. So at each of these sites, I went out and did some experimental treatments. My first treatment was a fence plot, this one here, where I put a little fence up. I only made them 3 by 3 metres, and this was to stop wombats from digging under and letting wallabies and lyrebirds in. But 3 by 3 metres, wombats accept it, that they'll just go around. So this fence plot just was fenced and left. The second plots that I did at each site were simulated. So this one, I fenced lyrebirds out, but I visited them, and that's meant to be me with my rake, every month, and I replicated lyrebird foraging to simulate the ecosystem engineering effects of the lyrebirds, but without the lyrebirds actually eating the bugs in there. And then on the third plot was an unfenced reference plot where wild lyrebirds were free to forage. So the idea was that the difference between these two, the fenced and simulated, was engineering only, because one had engineering on the right here and the other one didn't, while the difference between these two was predation only. They both had the physical engineering, but only this one on the right had lyrebirds eating the invertebrates. And then within these plots, I measured a whole range of different things. I measured the amount of soil that was moved, I measured the litter depth, soil compaction, seedlings, vegetation, invertebrates, fungi, and soil chemistry. So there was a whole range of different measures that I took, and I was visiting them each month. So I'd take some measures at every monthly visit, and others every 3 months, and others every year. So depending on how much work they were. And these are the plots. So some of them looked quite dense with vegetation, like this one. So this one's had a huge amount of herb growth after 2 years of lyrebird exclusion, whereas others just mounded up in leaf litter. So this one was a fenced plot, and this one on the right here was a simulated plot. And the first thing to say is that lyrebirds moved a lot of litter and soil. So this is single red, one of the well-known lyrebirds in Sherbrooke. Unfortunately, he's lost his metal band, so he has no number. We'll never truly be sure who he is. But he's just turning over masses of soil there. And you can see how powerful his claws are as he rakes through the litter and soil. We measured the amount of soil that each lyrebird could move because we have some numbers from Sherbrooke Lyrebird Survey Group. So for Sherbrooke Forest, we've got an estimate of the population. So for each lyrebird, we can estimate how much soil it moves. And to give you an idea of this, we'll take our lyrebird that weighs in at about 900 grams and compare him to a standard dump truck. And for every lyrebird in Sherbrooke, they're moving about this much soil and litter in a single year. So that's 11 standard dump trucks, around 350 tonnes per lyrebird in a year. So it's an extraordinary amount of soil displacement. But what does this do for the litter and the soil? So firstly, litter, I expected in these fence plots would build up, and sure enough, it did very quickly. The leaf litter in the fence plots was much, much deeper than in the simulated and the unfenced plots where lyrebirds were foraging. So the litter depth got deeper. And then secondly, the soil compaction increased. So in this little plot here, I was measuring them with a little, that's meant to be me with my soil compaction meter. The soil actually became quite dense, whereas in these other plots, the soil remained nice and friable because the lyrebirds were getting in and fluffing it over and scratching through it. So all of this changed the habitat quite dramatically. And this had implications for seedling growth or seedling germination. So in the fenced plots on the left here, we saw very few seedlings actually germinate, while in the simulated and the unfenced, there were large numbers of seedlings that were coming up right through the 2-year period. And this photograph sort of shows just what I'm talking about here. So all of these little seedlings are mostly prosmas or the prickly currant, which have the nice tasty red berries in summer, and a whole range of herbs like hound's tongue and little geranium and violet there. So they're really promoting all the germination of these seeds, which is having big implications for, potentially big implications for the evolution of plants, because if all these seeds are germinating, which would otherwise not, they're having the chance to express their phenotypes or their genetic characteristics in form, and then evolution can select on them. So it's potentially quite an important process for plants. But what about for animals? So to look at invertebrates, I visited my plots every 12 months with a little fixed volume soil core, and I collected samples of litter and soil and all the invertebrates within them. And I used a thing called a Tulgren funnel to extract the invertebrates. And it's a bit of a Dr. Evil thing where you've got a funnel of a cylinder and a little grate of mesh where you put your litter and soil and the invertebrates, and then you put a light source at the top and a funnel with ethanol at the bottom. And of course, as the litter and soil dries out, the invertebrates crawl down and fall into the ethanol. And at that point, you can take them out, look at them and count them. And I had a fantastic local entomologist, Annette Anderson, go through and count these invertebrates for me, because honestly, it would have been a whole PhD in itself just to learn that. And fortunately, Annette's got a whole PhD on invertebrates. And she counted a total of 197,880 invertebrates and identified them and classified them into length categories. Just an extraordinary effort. And then I went along and used allometric equations, which who would have known? All these scientists have got these equations to work out the weight of invertebrates, different genera of invertebrates based on their length. So I was actually able to estimate the biomass of invertebrates in my plots from these allometric equations. So quite an interesting thing to exercise to go through. And sure enough, engineering in action was seen. So lyrebirds, through their engineering effects in changing the soil and creating little habitat niches in the litter, were actually able to increase not only the richness, but also the biomass of the invertebrates that they eat. So in summary, there's good evidence that lyrebirds act as ecosystem engineers. They cause significant change to litter and soil structure, and foraging was spatially and temporally widespread. They were all over the forest all throughout the year, and they facilitate seedling germination and increase richness and biomass of invertebrates. So really good evidence that these lyrebirds are actually a very important species in the environment. So now I want to take a bit of a, as I said, a changing gear and talk a little bit about the megafires of last summer. And I really do want to frame the rest of this presentation in that context. And while it's really important to be hopeful and solutions oriented and to try and be optimistic about the future, I don't want to either, likewise, gloss over the impact of these really significant fires. So, and I think in Australia, we're in a position where with eucalypts, we see eucalypts responding to fire, and they do so with these what are called epicormic buds that grow out of the trunks and the large branches and make the trees look green really quickly after a fire. So the perception of the public might be, look at that forest, it's just booming, it's green, it's lush, it's healthy, but it's not necessarily the same forest after a burn as it was beforehand. In fact, they're generally not. They're generally quite different in their plant composition, in the structure of the plants that grow there. So it really is something to keep in mind when you see forests recovering from fire. And often with environmental disturbances like drought, it's sort of death by 1,000 cuts. You have incremental land clearing or incremental disease spread or incremental climate change. But here we've got this huge pulse event that's occurred in just a single year. 10 or 12 million hectares on the east coast of Australia of forest, all burning in 1 year. And that's not counting the other 6 or 8 million hectares in the top end that burns more regularly in the savannah. And the reality is that no ecosystem has really had to deal with that before. These were quite unprecedented fires in not just their extent, but also their severity, which meant that places like this Gondwanan rainforest with these Antarctic beaches were burning for the first time ever. And that's a pretty significant thing to see in our lifetimes. Of course, this was the smoke plume on the left here that we know went through to New Zealand and then on to South America. But what did this mean for the lyrebird? So I've put up on the right-hand side here a map from Glenn Emke. So this is Glenn from BirdLife, who has done this GIS analysis of the range of the species and the impacts on the fire. And you can see the hatched outline here is the range of the lyrebird. There are 3 subspecies marked there. And the orange sections are the fire footprint. And you can see that a lot of this area is actually orange. So Glenn's estimate is that almost 40% of the lyrebird's distribution in Australia has gone up in flames in just this 1 year. 40%. And what does this look like? Well, these are photographs that I've taken over the last 2.5 years on collaborative projects on lyrebirds across the country, right up from Girraween National Park in Queensland down to East Gippsland around Bem River. And you'll recognise some of these place names from the news, like Mallacoota or Clifton Creek, where the little primary school burnt down. And in fact, this bird up here in Clifton Creek, he was on a private property, and the family that had built this house there had built their house to survive fire. And indeed it did, with a lot of water that they put on it, but they have a green roof, and this green roof remained green after the fire. And this lyrebird actually went and built a display mound on their roof above their carport, because it was the only patch of green vegetation on the ground in his whole territory, and for kilometres in fact. So a really remarkable thing. But this does allude to the next slide, and that is that lyrebirds have a few tricks up their sleeve. So you might have recognised, or you might recognise this photograph from The Age back during the fires. This was taken by PJ Wallace up in a place called Wollombi, which is in the Hunter. And she had about 20 lyrebirds come into her farm dam in front of this fire. You can see here, a lot of them are actually mature males, which is interesting. But these lyrebirds would have come from a really long way to be here, because all of these would have been territory holding birds, and they've remembered, one, they've remembered that the dam is there, and 2, they've perceived that as a safe place to go in a fire front. And apparently a lot of these birds she saw before the fire, and when she came out, a lot of them were still in the dam. So they are quite good at surviving the fire. And in fact, every large fire event, there are stories of lyrebirds that come into creeks to shelter from the fire, and they'll even push in under blankets, wet blankets with people to survive the fire front. So they overcome their fear of humans to survive. And of course, they go down wombat holes, they go into mine shafts. And it's actually not the fire front itself that represents the biggest threat to lyrebirds. So now I just want to talk a bit on lyrebird habitat use and relate that to why lyrebirds are impacted by fires. So back in 2014 with Professor Andrew Bennett, I did my honours year in Sherbrooke Forest to look at the local and landscape drivers of habitat selection. And I wanted to look at 3 aspects of lyrebird ecology: their foraging, the male calling positions, and the nest position. So lyrebirds eat a range of different things, as I've alluded to before, whole range of invertebrates in the litter and soil. And it's an energetically costly foraging technique because they can't see their prey before they dig it up. So they scratch, 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 and oh, there's a bug, and they'll eat that, and they'll eat that. So they can't be selective. They have to eat pretty well anything they find. And this includes yabbies and scorpions. They sort of eat the body and leave the claws. And they take one prey item for every 3 or 4 seconds of digging. And Alan Lill discovered that while watching a lot of lyrebirds in Sherbrooke Forest back in the 90s. So what I found was that where lyrebirds foraged had a relationship with low structure of vegetation. So I'll draw your attention to this graph on the left here. And on the y-axis here, I've got the probability of occurrence of foraging. And then on the x-axis, I've got low strata complexity. So this means just how dense the vegetation is under 1/2 metre. And you can see as the vegetation becomes more dense, the likelihood of foraging decreases because they don't like to fight their way through dense scrub to try and get to the bugs in the litter. So of course, when a forest burns, such as the picture on the right here, this is typical wet forest. This was after Black Saturday in Marysville. A lot of the wet forest eucalypts died, so there's no canopy there. And very quickly you get a flush of dense vegetation, in this case a lot of bracken, but then a lot of small shrubs follow as well. And this really impedes lyrebirds from feeding there. So now I'll talk a little bit about their courtship. Lyrebirds are winter breeding, so right now is the height of the breeding season. The males are going crazy in Sherbrooke Forest, and they clear these stages in the forest. So this bird is standing on his mound, and the mound is constructed in a place with a nice open area above it so that the tail's well lit. And they used to think that this was where the eggs were made and laid, and they thought, oh, what a lovely male. He fans the eggs and he protects them. And of course, that's all rubbish. And I'll show you a picture of a nest in a minute. It's nothing like it. And this is where he does his song and where he mates. So to look at where these positions were in the landscape, I used Dawn's survey data. So every year, the Sherbrooke Lyrebird Survey Group invite the community to come out over 3 Saturdays in the depths of winter at 6 AM. So it's dark, it's cold, it's sometimes wet. And we go out, we get up to 60 or 80 people each morning, and we go to positions in the forest and listen for the male's dawn calls. And each male starts singing, and we get a compass direction and triangulate the position of each of the males. So I used this information to work out where the males were calling from. And I found that they associated their territories generally with wet forest. They preferred to be in the mountain ash. None of them were in rainforest, and very few were in damp forest. And there was a trend with topographic positions. So the males preferred to call from upper slopes or mid slopes, and they avoided the gullies. And this made sense because it's about acoustic prominence. If you're trying to project your call out and advertise to the females and tell the other males to nick off, then that's how you're going to do it. You're going to do it from higher in the landscape. And this is a male on a mound trying to do just that. And if you turn up your sound, you'll hear the mimicry. So listen to the call change when the female comes. That's the lasers. And her crest is raised. She's taking a close look at that tail, listening to the song and watching the dance. And after a brief assessment, apparently she's off. Not good enough. So she'll go off now and she'll check the neighbouring males and see how good his call is and how pretty his tail is. And it's uncommon to see females visit male after male along a slope. And they're obviously very choosy about who they mate. And this bit's like his last ditch effort. Come back. But no luck. So of course, being ground foraging and with these big display mounds on the ground, lyrebirds are actually very vulnerable to foxes. And unfortunately, after fires, foxes and cats do really well to go to these burnt areas because they know that prey will be more available to them. And there's a lot of research by Bron Kradsky at Melbourne Uni and others at Deakin and Charles Sturt that are really showing that foxes and cats take advantage of burnt areas. So this is another impact after fires on our poor old lyrebirds. This is an image of a fox checking out a lyrebird mound. And they really are incredible predators. They're incredible animals. They're actually incredibly beautiful animals too. But of course, they really do not belong in this country and wreak havoc. In Sherbrooke, we've been fortunate to have a really good fox control program. And I'll show you some, what I think is really good evidence of the success of this program. So this graph that I'm about to show you is the number of male lyrebirds detected on annual dawn counts on the y-axis here, and the years from 1990 through to 2016 on the x-axis. I'll have to update it, but it's much the same the last few years. And this point that I've flagged here is when Parks Victoria switched to quite an intensive fox control program and started doing putting a lot of effort into these foxes. And you can see the number of males flat for the first few years, and then the fox control kicked in and we've seen an incredible recovery. When I started it was actually about that time period in 2000. There were about 26 males on our count, I think. And the last count we've had for the last 3 years, we've had over 60 males. So more than doubling of the population. It's just been an incredible recovery. So back to the ecology. While the males are up on the slopes and the hills trying to advertise for the females, the girls are away doing all the work. And they're building this big domed structure of a nest, and it could be on the ground like the one on the left here, or it could be 15 metres up in a tree. And in that nest, they line it with lovely grey feathers and lay a single egg clutch, except for very strange occurrences of twin egg clutches that generally fail. And then they have this really prolonged incubation. So they have to sit on this nest for another 6 weeks while the egg is incubated, and then the chicks on the nest for a further 6 weeks. So it's a really long period of time that the female and then the chick are vulnerable. And you can imagine for a nest like this on the ground, foxes and cats could easily get that. But a nest 15 metres up a tree like this also is really vulnerable and almost never succeeds. And that's because things like this lovely grey goshawk, but rather evil bird, will have a go at it. And indeed brown goshawks as well. So here's a brown goshawk out from Frank Pierce out in Christmas Hills, and this lyrebird nest has been discovered by a goshawk. However, lyrebirds aren't totally defenceless. And I might see if Jen can put up the poll now to ask whether people knew that female lyrebirds mimic and sing. So I wanted to just quickly mention Vicky's talk here, Vicky's PhD at this point. Vicky Austin's up at Western Sydney. She's a good friend of mine, and she's doing a PhD on mimicry and song in female lyrebirds because she thinks that lyrebird song in females is functional. And she thinks that for this reason. I'll just play this sound. So we've got a pretty good number coming through of people that do know that females sing, so that's pretty good. I'll play this sound and see if people can recognise it. So for those that are birders, you might recognise this to be the call of a wedge-tailed eagle. And if you approach a lyrebird nest, this is likely one of the calls that you might hear from the female defending it. And interestingly enough, she'll do that call and come at you, and it's quite remarkable. And while for something like a goshawk it might be a little futile, if you're a grey currawong or a pied currawong coming to steal an eagle chick, you might think twice about doing that if there's a big eagle about to bear down on you. So the poll results suggest that 29% knew that they did, and 34% never thought about it. So there you go. And 37% didn't. So that's a pretty even split. So I'll feed that one back to Vicky for her research. That's quite interesting. So thank you for that. So I just want to play you now a second call, which I heard from the same female doing that wedge-tailed eagle. And I think you'll all recognise what animal made this sound. And this bird was way in the middle of nowhere, up on Mount Donabuang, and that was the call she chose to make when I went to visit her nest. And she's got good reason to think that that might be a scary call. This is a nest in the same location, actually. That's the nest there. And here comes the feral cat into the nest. There was a month-old chick in that nest. The cat kills the chick and actually crawls into the nest. Here's the female down the bottom here, distraught at this cat sitting inside her nest, devouring her chick. An hour later, the cat leaves. So very good reason to see cats as a pretty scary animal if you're a lyrebird. But again, female lyrebirds have a few tricks up their sleeve. This is not a lyrebird in the corner here, this is the yellow robin, but the lyrebird will come down from here. So this is a little video of a female lyrebird who's been off collecting food for her chick. Her chick's in the nest hidden here. A lot of wandering Tradescantia on the roof, which is a very bad weed. And see if you can see under this bird's bill, there's a bulge. And that's what we call a gula pouch. And in that gula pouch, it's full of worms and spiders and amphipods, the little hoppers. And she jumps up and has this curved tail. And that curved tail is there because her tail doesn't fit in the nest when she broods the chick. So it gets this semi-permanent curve. So she feeds a load of food to the chick. And then after a few seconds, the chick turns around and produces a little fecal sac. And the sac's sort of wrapped in this very strong gelatinous coating. And the bird will then take that and carefully deposit it, in this case very carefully, in the right spot in the creek so that it floats away and takes all the smell with it. So that keeps the nest very clean. If she's away from a creek, then she'll bury it. And that's a fantastic adaptation of many birds, many songbirds, to keep their nests perfectly clean and odourless, so predators that use their noses to find their prey won't find the nest. And then she's off to get another load of food. So getting back to my honours study, where do lyrebirds nest? Well, on a landscape scale, I found a relationship with creeks, unsurprisingly. So on this graph here, we've got the probability of occurrence of a nest on the Y, and on the x-axis, distance of a creek. And as you increase the distance from a creek, you decrease the likelihood of a nest being there. So lyrebirds like to nest near creeks. Secondly, I looked at the forest type, and rainforest was actually very important. So this middle bar here is the probability of occurrence of nests in rainforest, and that is higher than any other forest type. So these rainforest areas, which as I mentioned before are rare in the landscape, there's not much of it, are actually really important breeding areas for lyrebirds. So when these burn in the fires, this is really bad news. And this image on the left here shows an optimal breeding habitat for the lyrebird in Sherbrooke Gully with some nice cool temperate rainforest, sassafras, mossy rocks, a nice clean creek with round rocks at the bottom. But unfortunately in Sherbrooke and across the whole state, there's a feral animal that's infiltrating these precious areas and doing this huge wallowing. And I'd usually ask an audience in person who knows what the animal is that has done this. And I'm sure a lot of you will know that this is Samba deer. So this actually would be a good point to ask Jen to put up our last little poll during the talk on deer. And I just wonder how many people knew that deer were a big problem in the Dandenong and Yarra Ranges. Hopefully a lot of people have been aware of this. But these deer are huge animals. They can weigh up to 350 kilograms. And you can see in this image here that all the foreground here has been denuded. So this was all mother shield fern, and the deer have just cleaned that out. So a really big issue. I can't turn my pointer off now. So about 72% of you say, yes, you knew deer were a big problem. So that's pretty good. That shows that we've got the message out there a bit. But one of the other issues with deer is antler rubbing. And it's a really sort of strange thing to see, but they actually go into rainforests particularly and like to rub their antlers on sassafras trees. And this is a sassafras here that's been killed by deer. It's been ring-barked and it's snapped and fallen over. And in places like Monbulk Creek in Sherbrooke Forest, about 95 or more % of the sassafras have been rubbed and are in some sort of state of decline. And this has really happened over the last 20 years. It's been an absolute tragedy to see. And you can imagine for all the stream invertebrates, it's a disaster because all the turbidity, the murkiness in the water just makes life impossible for those animals. So in Sherbrooke Forest, we've been trying to fence some of these sassafras off from, well, at least protect them from the antler rubbing from the deer. So we've had some contractors in that have been doing a fabulous job to get these fenced protectors on the mature sassafras. And the idea of this is that we're just going to stop the deer from killing those trees, and hopefully in the long term we'll get a real solution to deer control, and there'll still be a seed source of sassafras in the Dandenongs. 2 years ago there was a draft Victorian deer strategy, and this hasn't progressed any further. So we've been waiting a long time for this, and if there's one thing that you could do as a result of this talk, it would be to contact your local member and say, what are you doing about this deer disaster? And it's not just Sherbrooke, it's right through East Gippsland in warm temperate rainforests as well as cool temperate. And unfortunately, after the fires in 2009, deer numbers exploded, and there's no reason to expect that won't happen again. So what about nests at a local scale? Well, I found that leaf litter had a really strong influence on where lyrebirds nest. So again, I've got my graph here, probability of occurrence on the Y and litter depth. When you increase in litter depth, you get a better habitat quality for nesting. And so obviously when you have fires, even cool burns, the first thing that happens is the leaf litter goes, and that results in some very hungry chicks. So in summary, the fire impacts on lyrebirds are quite varied. There's streamside vegetation. When that burns, that's really important to them, as is rainforest. Food sources go, predators come in, and feral deer spread. So to try and address this, a project that I'm involved in with BirdLife is looking at trying to do a number of things: map fire impacts on habitat, identify priority sites and refuges, and then also look at the suitability of the lyrebird as an umbrella species for conservation of wet forest birds. So how well does looking after the lyrebird look after other species? And then identify some of these immediate threats. Pamela Fallow has put together a little guide to tell people how you can, in practical ways, help lyrebirds. And over the next 10 months, I'll be looking at fire severity and how that's affected lyrebirds. So these maps here, fire severity maps, and the black areas in this fire here are very extreme. So all the canopy is being consumed, while in this lower one here, there's very little canopy being consumed. So obviously, if you're a lyrebird, this fire up the top here is going to have a really big impact, and this one not so great because some of these, well, most of these gullies remain unburnt. So it's all about that sort of thing. So there's lots of work to be done in identifying refuges, protecting unburnt habitat, controlling feral predators, and controlling feral deer. But I just want to finish off now back in Sherbrooke Forest in 2020, and I wanted to leave you with this footage of this male lyrebird preening his tail out in preparation for the breeding season. This is some behaviour that you often see when they're bathing or on a wet day when the feathers are all drenched. It makes me consider how lucky we are to have these birds in our backyard, but also how important this population is in the context of all wildfires of 2019 and 20, both in a scientific perspective, from a scientific perspective, but also for the conservation of the species on a broad scale across the country. And this behaviour is something that I've managed to film this year with I've just discovered my 5D's ability to do video. I normally use this camera for stills, but I just love the movement in this action of preening and cleaning the tail. It's really special. So with that, I'd like to say thanks very much to everyone for tuning in. And it's great to see so many friends as well that have been involved with the Lyrebirds over many years, that when I scroll through the participant names, and might open up for questions and maybe Jen's last poll as well. So thanks very much. Just some acknowledgements too. I'll leave them up there while we have some questions maybe.
Hey Alex, I just wanted to say huge thank you for that. That is a fantastic talk. We've had so many questions, so many people loving it, so many people really loving your photos and your videos actually as well. People really, really appreciating those. So thank you so much. That was really brilliant. You covered so much information. And yeah, it was really fantastic. We did actually have a quick request. I'm just going to do one more poll before we get to the questions. We did have a request from someone. Could you replay the female lyrebird noise? Because they missed it the first time. So if you could replay that. Well, I just put up I think it's our last poll, and it's just to find out what actions you're going to do now that you've heard this webinar. So while Alex finds that female lyrebird, if you can just put out what you're going to be doing now that you've attended this webinar. Here we go. So Alex is going to do that songbird, I think.
I'll start. I guess it'll be the cat most likely that people will be interested in, but. So that was the cat, and this was the wedge-tailed eagle. That's often, I find I often hear that call when the eagles are dive bombing one another. And to a lyrebird, that would look really scary, I think.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so we're still getting some people coming in. So what actions are going to take after this webinar? So the options are, for those who, I know we've had some issues with the polls, not everyone's been able to see them, but the options are, will you ask your local politician about what they're doing about the feral deer disaster? Will you record sightings of lyrebirds and other notable birds like owls in the BirdLife Australia bird data app? Will you report fox sightings in national parks to Parks Victoria? Build a cat run so that your pet cat is not allowed to roam outdoors, and maybe join a local friends group or Indigenous nursery to help improve wildlife habitat and meet amazing people. So some really good options there, lots of things going through. So I'm just going to close that one now, and then I will share. So you can see the majority of people, 67%, are going to be asking their local politician about what they're doing about the feral deer disaster, which is really, really good. So I really hope you all do that, because as Alex pointed out, that's a really, really important topic. And then 52% of people are going to be downloading the BirdLife Australia's bird data app, 47% reporting fox sightings, 40% joining a local friends group, which I am loving that, and also 10% building a cat run, so their pet cat's never allowed out to roam outside, which is fantastic. So thank you so much, everyone. I'm really excited that you're going to be taking some actions after this fantastic webinar. And then, oh my goodness, we've got so many questions coming in, Alex. I'm just going to remind everyone that you can upvote any of the questions you like. So you'll see a little sort of thumbs up sort of thing. So you'll be able to upvote which questions you like. But let me just kind of go, if we go to some of the ones we had, I'm just going to try and pick some ones at random. One we had here from Michelle is, can you have too many lyrebirds in an area? Can there be too much soil movement? About how they reduce the fuel load. So can you answer that one, Alex?
Yeah, that's actually a really, really interesting question. And I think we're probably at the point where we're seeing a near saturation point in Sherbrooke Forest. So with so many birds now, we're really seeing pressure on the males to defend their territory. And a lot of birds are running around and pulling each other's feathers out and fighting, and it's really quite amazing to see. There was still, from my PhD work, it suggested there was still similar density of population at Sherbrooke to Yarra Ranges and Britannia Creek. They're actually the most common animal on the cameras that I put up to see how many herbivores were there, how many deer, how many wallabies, wombats. Lyrebirds were by far the most common species. And as to the soil, at some point, presumably the invertebrate food source would be depleted. So I would expect there'd be a self-regulation mechanism to kick in at some point, particularly in cool temperate rainforests where the ground's quite open. If the birds have really turned everything over, then there's just not going to be the same amount of food. So I suspect that in the next 5 to 10 years in Sherbrooke, we'll really see that hit a roof and on the population, and more birds will have to move out into the corridors. We've got the Sassafras Creek corridor where we have actually been surveying lyrebirds for many years, but the population hasn't grown considerably. There's still only about 4 males out there and maybe half a dozen females. So I don't think we've seen that expansion into those corridors yet.
Great, thank you. There was another question here about, do you know about the impact of controlled burns, and do they impact lyrebirds? They're not just sort of wildfires, but controlled burns?
Yeah, look, I suspect that controlled burns probably affect lyrebirds in similar ways to wildfires, just that the effects might be a little shorter lived. Because as I mentioned, the litter layer is where they get their food. And this is precisely the layer of vegetation and fuel that you're trying to burn off with a control burn. If you listen to someone like Philip Zylstra, he'll tell you that he's a fire ecologist that will tell you in New South Wales, the authorities burnt about twice as much area in fuel reduction burns in the preceding 10 years coming up to these megafires than in any other decade ever. And we've still seen this enormous wildfire and this enormous result, this incredible impact on forests. So it's an interesting point to keep in mind, and I really do think that for lyrebirds, any fire is probably going to be an issue for them. It doesn't really matter whether it's fuel reduction or wildfire.
Okay, another question. This is sort of, I'm just going to go with ones that have been upvoted really, because there's so many coming in. Does the poop of the chick come out covered in the gelatinous material, or does the female actually wrap it prior to disposal?
No, they've got this really bizarre anatomy, which it comes out fully wrapped in the gelatinous sac, and they lose the ability to make this gelatinous sac on virtually the day they fledge, which is just so weird. I don't know how physiologically that works, but you'll often see on the day they fledge a runny fecal sac. So the females gone to collect the sac and it's broken, which must be completely disgusting for the bird, and it's broken on the front of the nest, and the bird's gone that day. So yeah, really good question though.
Another one is, what type of tree do lyrebirds nest in?
Oh, they'll nest in a range of different trees. Usually the high nests, as I say, they get picked off by currawongs and goshawks. They'll nest in hollow eucalypts. Some silly birds nest in tree fern crowns. And the trouble with that is that, firstly, goshawks can actually see them because the tree fern crown really just adds, it's like a target if you're flying over the canopy. But also the fronds come up and they destroy the nest in spring. So if you're not really early, if you're an early nester, you might get away with it, but usually the fronds will destroy your nest, so not a good place.
And then we just have some more questions about people who are interested about the deer and what access to the damage do we have? So what can people say to their MPs? What sort of detail can they give to their MPs when asking, and what sort of control do we actually want to have?
Yeah, so that's another great question. Well, a lot of the impacts are on erosion, so the creeks are really sensitive. I think if we let this go, in my lifetime, I fully expect to see the extinction of rainforest in the Dandenong Ranges. It just can't cope with feral deer at the densities that they are at in say, Monbulk Creek. There's just no way it won't be able to survive. So it's the loss of rainforest. Rainforest is a threatened vegetation community, erosion to creek banks, pollution of water. There's also a whole range of problems with agriculture. So vineyards are getting really hit hard by deer. So a lot of viticulturalists are very upset. So there's a whole range of issues to the environment and agriculture, and I'd mention all of those.
Excellent. Okay. First of all, we had a few questions. People just wanting to know if they'll be able to access this presentation later. Yes, we have recorded it, so we will be sending you a link to where it will be uploaded. Do give us a few days though to upload it, because we're going to have to edit it down a little bit to take off my ramblings at the start mostly. But yeah, you will be able to access it, and yeah, you'll be able to share it. And someone's asking how they can contact you, Alex. So my email will be in that email that you'll be getting next week. And I can forward any emails on to Alex if you've got any other questions for him as well, if we don't get to all of your questions. Someone has a question here though about fox control. Are you able to advise on the control measures, please? Was it baiting, trapping, or a mixture of various methods? I think that was relating to when you were talking about the Sherbrooke control that Parks Vic were doing.
Yeah. So I think on balance, baiting has the most support from the peer-reviewed science, has been the most effective, and that's been our experience. Other control methods, and this goes for deer too, like I didn't mention before, the control methods for deer, I just realised, but volunteer shooting was tried in Sherbrooke. And my point was that it's too much to put on volunteers, to ask volunteers to deal with a problem of such scale is not fair. So in the deer strategy, unfortunately, the draft strategy just was very heavily reliant on volunteers, and I thought that was really poor, and no emphasis on research into other control methods. And that really, to me, that just is crazy. We need to be looking at other methods. Same with foxes. I mean, foxes, 1080 baiting. A lot of people really don't like 1080, but it's actually, as far as chemicals go, it's better for this country than anywhere else, because the chemical compound naturally occurs in a lot of plants. So a wedge-tailed eagle has to eat a whole number of baits before it falls over, whereas a fox only needs a third of a bait. And same for dogs. I might just add that, you know, we're seeing a lot of dog walkers in Sherbrooke at the moment, and there's an active bait run going on there right now. And, you know, I just tell people, your dog, if it picks up even a quarter of a bait, it's going to die, and there's nothing you can do about it. So 1080, it's not ideal, but it's the best we've got at the moment.
And I think that leads on a little bit more about the cat predation in the Yarra Ranges. Someone wanted to know here, Joanna, has that lessened since cats on property rules, since the rules about your cat's not allowed to leave your property in the Yarra Ranges? Have you noticed a difference in that?
Look, to be honest, I think the biggest benefits of that are probably flowing to smaller birds in people's properties or around people's in edge environments. We're very fortunate in Sherbrooke in that if we see cats, usually they can get caught by the rangers, and it's not big enough to have a truly feral population. So we're really dealing with house cats that are straying. And fortunately, we've had very few lyrebirds killed recently by cats. And most of the lyrebirds that have been killed by cats in the past have been chicks. So it's really this time of year that for the next 2 months that lyrebirds will be most vulnerable to cats, when the chicks are in the nests. But I think the benefits of keeping cats inside are clear. They eat, you know, millions of animals every year collectively. So yeah, a huge win for the environment to have cats restrained. Absolutely.
I totally agree. We've got a big question here from Roy. So I'm just going to read the whole question out because I can't really lessen it down. So this is relating back to your plot trials. In the undisturbed, unfenced plot, do you not think the lyrebird is out of its natural ecosystem where coprosma seedlings are establishing, as these would be destroyed next time the lyrebird works there? Or does it leave this area intact until the coprosma establishes? I would think, not given the current pressure on habitat, I can, oh, I've just lost the question, but it was basically talking about that. Sorry, it was the question.
Yeah, that's a really valid point. And interestingly enough, I looked at seedlings as well, and I didn't really go into much detail on this, but the contribution of seedlings, so I called a germinant a little tiny seed that was germinating, and a seedling something that was bigger than a little germinant, so it had true leaves, and but it was thinner than my little finger. So those seedlings actually were didn't change much. So the lyrebirds were effectively making up for the plants that they pull out through their scratching, because they do destroy plants, but it was about equal to the amount that they germinate, is how I interpreted that result. So the net effect on raw seedling density was nil, if you like, but there was higher turnover because it was one seedling after the other getting pulled out, and then another one would germinate. So that I think answers that question, hopefully.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Sorry, there's so many more questions still to go. I hope everyone's all right to stay around for a little bit longer. Another question is, well, a couple of questions really about lyrebird sort of behavior. Do they have their own territory, and do male and female stay together as partners or not? Do they kind of have a long-term mating, or do they kind of separate off?
Yeah, if you read the sort of old literature on lyrebirds, they're very faithful, and they get married and they live for together for many years. And if one dies, the other will go off and die of sadness in the valley, and all of this sort of thing, which of course is utter fantasy. The males will mate with as many females as they can, but it's female mate choice. So they don't pair up per se. They might mate with the same male if he's the best male year after year, but I don't think they're particularly faithful. And what was it? Oh, territories. Yes. So both males and females fiercely defend territories. So I mentioned the males pulling each other's tail feathers out. Well, females can be equally as nasty. And if you talk to Vicky Austin, she's got a fantastic podcast with Anne Jones on Off Track, and that's a really interesting listen, because she talks about just how aggressive females can be, even destroying each other's nests, which is quite brutal.
I love that. It's such an interesting little world they live in.
Yeah.
Another question, I think someone just wanted to know, a few people wanted to know where they can get the flyer regarding supporting lyrebirds. Is there more information they can actually have to hand out to other people? Is there any way they can get hold of that? Oh, hang on, Alex, I think you've gone on mute for some reason. Oh, hang on, you've gone again. There we go.
Am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Having trouble with the speaker for some reason. The web address for that flyer is actually on the slide. So if people look back at the recording, they'll be able to find that web address. Otherwise, contact me and I can send it out for sure.
Yeah. And just contact Alex, you contact me, and I'll be on your email. People are interested in weeds, because you obviously had the female lyrebird's nest was surrounded by a lot of trad. Is there are weeds a problem? Is there a high threat weed to lyrebirds? Oh, you've gone up mute again, Alex.
Why? Can you hear me now, Jen?
There we go, you're back.
Yeah, I'm not sure why it's having trouble with the speaker, but it's telling me my speaker's not working. So I do apologize.
It's still there for me.
Yeah, weeds, anything that mats over the ground, like wandering trad that creates a really thick mat, that's going to be a big issue for lyrebirds just to forage in those areas. Anything that's dense. So Friends of Sherbrooke Forest have done a lot of work to pull weeds out and treat weeds in Sherbrooke, and that's undoubtedly helped that recovery too.
And then another couple of questions. I'm sorry, we're going to try and wrap up soon, Alex, because otherwise I think people could be here for years. But I think we'll stay for sort of 5 more minutes if you're all right with that.
Yep.
So we've got a couple of questions about, again, their behaviour. How far away from a mound does a female nest? And then the second question is, how much exposure to another animal's call before the lyrebird can actually learn it?
Yeah, two questions that we've pondered over a lot. Mounds don't seem, or nests and mounds don't seem to have any relationship to one another that I've ever been able to work out. So the males might be 1 kilometre away from a female if it's in Sassafras Creek, or they might be 150 metres, or the mound might be right next to the nest. But there doesn't seem to be any predictable pattern that I've come across anyway. And as for the call and the time it takes to learn the call, it's a really good question. Because lyrebirds learn which calls to sing from the older birds, it can be really hard to teach birds new calls. And, you know, there's been some funny things, like the BBC tried to teach the captive bird at Hillsville how to sing pop songs a few years ago. And it was an utter disaster. This bird just had this horrible pop song playing every night when the tourists would go home. And he never picked up one shred of that pop song, despite it playing every day for like over a month. So very unlikely to be able to measure that easily. And the young birds can pick up things. I suspect they can pick them up very quickly, like probably within a matter of days or weeks if they're interested. But it's just, how do you get a lyrebird interested in a sound to produce it, is the tricky bit.
That poor bird being played some rubbish song every day. For it. Another question, you talked about weeds before, but we have someone asking the opposite. Is there any kind of lyrebird friendly plants they can plant in their gardens?
They like anything that's a middle story plant, because middle story shrubs, so taller shrubs like musk daisies, blanket leaf, austral mulberry are the local plants around here that are sort of small trees, and they provide really good cover and really good litter. So they're the ones to go for, those smaller trees.
Someone else is asking as well, we've obviously, I think during lockdown, everyone's out and about in their forests and things a lot more than they usually were. And there's been a lot of social media posts recently, because obviously it's lyrebird mating season, of people getting footage of lyrebirds, getting their calls, photos and things. Does this have an impact on the lyrebird population? Does this upset them or stress them? Is there anything we should be not doing when we're out walking in the forest?
Yeah, so that's a good point, and we've had a fair bit of activity around this on our Facebook page, on the Sherbrooke Lyrebird Survey Group Facebook page, and it has been a really trying time for the lyrebirds with so many people in the forest going into the mounds. I think the main thing to keep in mind is to not spend too much time with a bird, because when the lyrebirds are being approached or chased through the bush, even if you're not really upsetting the bird, you will still be changing the behaviour. And while it doesn't matter if it's just you once on a Monday morning, but if that same Monday there's 10 tourists that come in later on after you've done that and do the same thing and follow a bird around, it really starts to mess with that bird's ability to display and sing and attract females. So, and obviously if you ever find a nest, be really careful around nests. Don't damage the vegetation. You know, if you're interested, have a quick look in, but you'll notice pretty quickly the females get quite aggravated, and you're elevating the stress levels of that bird if you hang around for too long. So it's mostly common sense.
Thanks, Alex. That's really helpful. We've got some more people asking you to learn their noises as well, other than the pop song that you mentioned. Do they pass noises down from generation? And also, if you hear sort of one lyrebird, is it likely to be, if you hear a certain noise coming from one lyrebird, is it likely to be one lyrebird or multiple birds that know the same song?
So usually, to answer the first one, I'll answer that with a story from Tasmania. So in Tasmania, when they transported the 11 pairs of lyrebirds down, 22 birds or thereabouts, those lyrebirds were caught at Mount Tullibawong in Hillsville, and they all did whipbird mimicry. And in Tasmania, there are no whipbirds. And for generation after generation, whipbird remained one of the prominent calls in the Tasmanian lyrebirds. So they certainly do pass the call down culturally. But now, so we're now almost, sort of 70 or 8, what are we, almost 100 years on, those lyrebirds have mostly lost the whipbird call. So But that's in recent decades. And what was the second part about the court?
Do they just have, when if you hear a lyrebird making a specific noise, do you think it's probably just one lyrebird, or do you think there's chances are that there'll be a few of them learning it?
Yeah, so at this time of year, that's a good question too, because at this time of year, you'll hear males doing the same suite of calls, and it might be only 20 species of other bird, or 25 calls, and every male in that area where they can hear each other will do those same calls. But in summer, when you hear that sort of sub-song, odd sort of improvisations, that's when you can hear really interesting calls, because the males just seem to do everything, and it's the rules don't apply then. But at this time of the year, it's very predictable what you'll hear in the population.
Okay, sorry, I've still got so many questions coming in, Alex. I'll try and wrap them up soon. Someone wants to know, do you know what the population of lyrebirds is throughout Australia, or at least in specific areas? Do we know how they're going?
So no is the answer. We really don't know. In the southern subspecies of the superb lyrebird, BirdLife, in this BirdLife project, we're hoping to look at trying to get a measure of activity. So it won't be counting birds per se, but it will be getting a measure of activity in those areas. So we'll see how widespread they are, but and how they're recolonising after the fire, or how well they're going. But in Sherbrooke, I've got a population estimate of around 350 to 400 lyrebirds. So it's bigger than I thought when I actually did the calculations on the banded birds and the re-sightings. So that's pretty good. And if you work it out per bird, it's about 3 hectares per bird, or thereabouts.
And someone wants to know, are lyrebirds good flyers? Because you've had some couple of videos of them flying, and can they easily change their territory by flight?
They can fly, but they don't fly a long distance. So they fly to get up and away from a fox, or they'll fly up to the tops of the mountain ash to roost at night, and they actually roost right in the canopy of the trees. And to see them fly down, glide down, is fantastic, but they're not strong flyers. So they don't sort of have powered flight where they just go along like a cockatoo would or something.
I'm just going to do a couple more questions. I'm so sorry, I'm not going to get to all your questions. I'm trying to scroll through and try and pick out ones that seem similar to other people. So I do apologise. If you still have a question, like I said, I will be sending you an email on Monday. You'll have my email address. You can send it to me and I can forward it on to Alex if there's still a burning question that we haven't got to today. So two more questions, I think. Are there any other animals competing for the invertebrates for their food source? Do they have any other competition in the forest?
That's a good question. They probably do. I mean, a lot of birds follow them around, like yellow robins and scrub wrens will follow a lyrebird and pick off the bits the lyrebirds miss. But nothing else in our forests down here digs to quite the same extent. So maybe bandicoots would have a similar sort of food, although they eat a lot more fungi than lyrebirds. So probably not exactly. In places like the subtropics around southern Queensland, the Albert lyrebird and the bush turkey have a similar sort of niche, but yeah, down here the lyrebirds are really the main drivers of that soil disturbance.
And someone else, I'm going to go the last question here because I think it's a really interesting one. Have there been any studies done on the genetics of them, and are we concerned about a genetic bottleneck that may have happened at some point, particularly after bushfire?
That's a really good question. To be honest, I don't think that we've really got. I mean, I showed you that map of the 3 subspecies, but if you look carefully at it, the lines are just completely arbitrary. One of them follows the border of Victoria, which I think, gee, how do they know that? There's really not a comprehensive genetic analysis of lyrebirds to date. As to whether there's a bottleneck, it probably won't be. From my understanding of genetics, which is not very much, it's more undergrad genetics, you don't need a whole lot of new genetic material to be introduced to a population to keep it viable. So hopefully it's okay. And I think it probably will be in terms of genetic bottlenecks or inbreeding, that sort of thing.
All right, thank you so much, Alex. I'm so sorry, everyone. I think we're going to have to wrap it up as we're sort of over time a little bit now. But Alex has so many comments thanking you for what a fantastic speech it was, a fantastic presentation. People saying it should be on TV. I think you're the new thing.
I'm terrible at that.
People are really, really excited. A lot of people asking what else they can do. I think follow maybe your groups on Facebook, aren't they? Friends of Sherbrooke.
Sherbrooke, well, Sherbrooke Lyrebird group and Friends of Sassafras Creek if you want somewhere in the corridors. Yep, for sure.
So follow both of those groups and then you'll learn other things to do. Even if we had someone asking they're in the city, what can they do? I think that contacting your state MP, is it state MP, Alex, or federal MP, which is better?
Oh, look, I mean, James Molino is our local MP and he's got an interest in deer. But Lily D'Ambrosio is a good one to go to. So I'd recommend either of those, particularly if you're in Molino's electorate, then that will carry more weight. But anyone like, Lily D'Ambrosio is equally as good, I think, to contact.
Excellent. So we're all in a pandemic, so get letter writing and getting your emails out there. And we just had to finish off, as we have one request. Can we see one more display of dancing or mimicking or moving or something like that, just to wrap it up while we all finish? So while you're finding that, I'll just say thank you so much again, Alex, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. As I said at the start, we do have more webinars coming up, so you will see an email about those. Do sign up. I think that hopefully they'll all be as good as Alex was today. But yeah, thank you so much again, Alex, for this morning. And I'll just leave you with these videos once he finds them. I encourage everyone to, if you are able to, if you live near a forest, or if you, once the pandemic's hopefully calmed down a little bit, do join a friends group or a Land Care group. Do go out and try and help our environment, and otherwise, write letters and educate others. Pass on what you've learned today and send this video, once we've got it uploaded, send this video to friends and family and get them to watch it, and hopefully everyone will be educated as well.
All right, I'll try and find this video.
I think we still have a square in the middle, Alex. I don't know if that's your polls.
That's my poll. Is that gone now?
What is that then? Otherwise, that's it gets in the way of the beautiful image. There we go, perfect.
Better? Good.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, we're getting there,
That's all right. Thank you so much for answering so many different questions. And again, I'm sorry I didn't get to everyone's. There was about 90 questions to try and get through. But everyone's been lots of lovely comments, but we'll end it on this.
Oh, thank you, Jen.